Yeah, thanks a lot, and thank you for having me. It's of course here in Denmark. It's a fantastic evening, and I'm really happy that so many of you chose to still spend this evening on talking about things that are close to my heart, which is about the green transition. And I'm of course very grateful for having this opportunity at all. Thinking about, I recently turned 67, and when you're getting old or older, I'm still 17 inside. As my wife says, I've got 50 years of experience of being 17. But when you get older, you can say, what is then your yardstick in an academic world or in a scientific world of how you're doing? One of the yardsticks is really simple. It is, does anybody really want to hear what you have to say? And that's, of course, I'm super grateful whenever somebody does want to listen. I'll be speaking tonight about the decarbonized energy system, something that's really dear to my heart. And of course, the background of the talk is not fun. It's about climate change, which is what I consider to be an essential threat to our well-being, welfare, human lives, our ability to strive for improvement and better conditions for people all around the world. The pictures on the right are from the summer of 22, which was, I found, particularly kind of distressing. The summer of 23 was actually worse, but the one in 22 was kind of the first of these extreme summers, 48 degrees in Sevilla and the Po River almost drying out, and wildfires in southern Europe that are no different from what we have decades of experience with from California. Now they are here. And if you look at our overall situation, it of course looks bleak with these growth rates we see on the diagram from NASA. Our present trajectory takes us to 2.7 degrees of temperature increase by the year 2100. If we get that, if that is where we land, then we'll have about 500 million of climate refugees, people who don't leave their homes because they would like to, but who leave because of climate effects on their environment, which can be about desertification and other things that are affecting their lives, but which can also be about their lives proper, the substance itself, which is that they might be living in places where they can live now, but where they simply cannot live. Agriculture, crops, or whatever, irrespective if the climate continues as it does, because either their home is swept away by the sea, or because it simply gets to be too hot to live there. If the temperature reaches 37 degrees and we have 100% humidity, as will be happening in parts of Southeast Asia, then you cannot live as a human person because you cannot cool. You can only live if you have air conditioning. And that means that if you get a power drop longer than so and so, you die. And that's not a viable proposition in every sense of the word. And the root cause of this is well known and simple. It's about the combustion of fossil fuels. We do have methane emissions from agriculture. We do have methane emissions from permafrost and so on. We do have some methane from waste products. We do have non-fossil industries like cement that emit CO2 as part of the process. But the real source of global warming is our combustion of fossil fuels. And it shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. We are burning now within a few decades what took hundreds of millions of years to deposit. So this is what it's all about. We need to phase out the fossil fuels. We essentially need to make this transition from, and this is super simple, of course, oversimplified. What I'm basically doing here is I'm saying that we don't do anything about the non-fossils and the waste. We are going to do that. But the main thing, and this is about keeping focus, is about avoiding 3/4 of the emissions. And we can do that by a much larger degree of electrification, but we also need fossil fuels. These percentages appear nowhere. They are my own estimates when looking at what emissions do we get now from aviation industry, shipping, and so on, household heating, etc. And whether the percentages are 28.7 on green fuels or something different is not really material. What is material is that even the green fuels will to a large extent come from electricity. This is about a fundamental transition of society from combustion of fossil fuels to the use of green electricity. That is what we need. That is what we take. And here's a picture of how a decarbonized energy system could look. This energy system relies on 3 resources: wind, sun, and biomass. It relies on 4 main conversion technologies: wind power, solar PV, biogas, and pyrolysis. And then it relies on some downstream processes: hydrogen, ammonia, and methanol, and of course also on storage of electricity. We can get all the electricity we want from the wind and the sun. We will need some storage to have 24/7 electricity 365 days a year, but it is beyond any doubt that we can get all our electricity from renewable sources. We do not need combust fossils for that. We can convert electricity also into hydrogen. Hydrogen is a main player in the refinery industry, and it's also a key building block for plastics and many other things. It is kind of an inconvenient gas because it doesn't want to become liquid on compression. You can liquefy hydrogen, but it requires deep cryogenic temperature. Unlike all other gases, with the exception of helium, hydrogen is, together with helium, the only gas that does not liquefy by compression at ambient temperature. Everything else does. It is gas at ambient temperature. That inconvenience can be surmounted by converting hydrogen to ammonia, because ammonia is a gas at room temperature, but it's easily compressed to become a liquid. That means that storage, transportation of ammonia is much easier than storage and transportation of hydrogen, unless with hydrogen you have a pipeline. Ammonia is a key constituent of fertilizers. All fertilizers start their life as ammonia. They might be liquid or dry, but they all start with ammonia. And it can also be used as a very convenient fuel. It does not have the heat of combustion of fossil fuels, but it has a big upside that it doesn't contain any carbon, and therefore there are no climate gas emissions from ammonia. If you combust ammonia, you will have to have a catalyst to remove NOxes, but it does not affect the climate with a genuine greenhouse gas. We can also use green carbon that we can acquire from biomass through gasification or pyrolysis to combine with hydrogen to make methanol. Methanol is also, like ammonia, a very convenient energy carrier and a very convenient chemical. It has the advantage over ammonia that it is liquid even at room temperature. and it has a big use case that it is the fundamental of most plastics in the world. You can make plastics many precursors, but most plastics could be made out of methanol. You don't need any other precursor than that. And finally, of course, we can use the products from biogas and pyrolysis directly as a gas or as an oil. And in that way, we can also, through pyrolysis and to some extent also through biogas, capture and sequester CO2. So this is, you can say, a fundamental contention, I should call it. You could call it a statement. But not call it a fact, because there will be people who dispute it. But I personally see no reason for any other mechanisms in a decarbonized energy system than these. You can then choose to have other mechanisms, but in my opinion, you don't need them. The most obvious choice would be to add nuclear. That is a complex thing. There are many countries in the world that already have nuclear power, and there are countries considering it, and there are countries that don't want nuclear power. Personally, where I come from in Denmark, we had in the 1970s and 80s a very big pushback from grassroots movements against nuclear. And I was part of that. And in my upbringing, you can say, as a energy person, not something from home, but what I thought myself, I did not consider nuclear as a viable option in Denmark. But I have to say that once you get to face the real terrible face of climate change, you need all the horses from the stables that you can get. And there my 50 years old aversion against nuclear has to disappear. We need it. The main problem is that we don't have time for nuclear. This was our curve from before. Our growth rate at the moment is 0.3 degrees per decade. So starting in 1975, our temperature rise will actually be not the 2.7 degrees that IPCC predict, but if you take the linear regression of the last 45 years, 45 years, I should say, almost 50 years, we get to a temperature rise of 3.75 degrees, not 2.7. And just so that you are aware of this, there were expectations or concerns 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that we would have a 6-degree temperature rise in this century. That does not look probable now, thank God. 3.75 degrees is much less than 6.2, but 3.7 degrees is very, very bad. Our 500 million climate refugees at 2.7 becomes 1 billion at 3.75. The social instability, the risk of wars, the pressure on more benign climate countries cannot be imagined now. We can't see now what this will lead us to. If we then look at nuclear power in this context, this is a diagram I have from Michael Liebreich, who founded Bloomberg New Energy Finance. What you see on the dark curve is the growth of renewables in the US, in China, in India, and the light blue is nuclear power. And as you can see, it's growing in China, but a much, much slower pace than renewables. In the other countries, US and India, it's a steady state. Last year, we added 507 gigawatts of renewables, and our addition of nuclear was, as far as I recall, minus 1.3 gigawatts. So even when you take into account that we have the prospects of small modular reactors and so on, we just can't see it happen. We don't have the time for them to become effective. This is a personal view, like everything I say. But I think we should promote it. But I don't think we are in any position to base our hopes on nuclear. Our hopes need to be based on renewables. And just to put it into perspective, I don't know if that is common knowledge in the UK engineering community. It certainly is not in Denmark. But if we look at our present day global production from renewables, and if we want to displace or substitute what is now produced of electricity from non-renewable sources, and on top of that, substitute all the fuel in the world that are fossil, then we need to expand our present day, as we sit here and talk, global capacity by something on the order of a factor of 30. We need 30 times much solar and wind capacity as we have now. That is the task we are faced with. So we have a huge problem with climate change. When I was a child, the huge problem was nuclear war, or the risk of that. That went away. Now it's kind of coming back. But even in that situation, our biggest challenge, without any doubt, is climate change. And in my opinion, we need renewables to solve that. Yes, let's take a look at hydrogen. Hydrogen is the link between green power and things that cannot be powered directly by green power. There is no other way. If we want to get from green electricity to fuels or fertilizers or power generation or green steel or green cement or whatever, the only way in is through hydrogen produced through with an electrolyzer. We can either then use the hydrogen as is, or we can convert it into synthetic fuels, in other words, fuels that contain carbon, which needs to be green, or we can convert it into ammonia, which does not need any green carbon, but can be made just with nitrogen from the air. And whichever way we go, we need to ship it, and then we can use in green steel, chemistry, in transportation, cement making. In heating, probably not. It's on this diagram here. I think you would always, when you can get away with it, favor heating with heat pumps driven directly by electricity. Power generation, to a large extent, the same thing, the exception of storage, which we can make. Hydrogen is what we call the vector from green power to a decarbonized society. Those fields where we cannot use green electricity. There are three technologies that work. We have selected one in my company that we work with, but one should keep an open mind. There's alkaline electrolysis. That's the old-fashioned one. It goes with nickel electrodes. It was used 100 years ago. You need a strong alkaline solution, and then you can produce hydrogen through a transport of hydroxide ions. You can also make an acidic environment, and in that we call it a proton exchange membrane electrolyzer, because we basically transport protons across the membrane instead of hydroxide ions. It is smarter in a way, in the sense that it uses less space. You can have a higher current density, but it has the big drawback that the only metal, the only catalyst that can be used on the anode is the metal iridium. That's a metal out of the platinum family. But when you are in an acidic environment at 80 degrees centigrade with a high concentration of acid and with a high concentration of oxygen, even platinum gives in and corrodes. The only material that doesn't corrode is iridium. And seen from my perspective, when I was looking at what should my company do on electrolyzers, we opted not for something that was using a rare and expensive metal. And finally, you have solid oxide electrolyzers. They use oxygen as the transport medium of iron. In order for that to happen, you need to have a high temperature, something on the order of 500 degrees centigrade. You don't need very fancy metals in your electrodes, but the big disadvantage here is that because you have those high temperatures, you need fancy chemistry overall and fancy mechanics. Otherwise, you won't get your materials to last. So when we made a choice, we chose to go down the alkaline way. We are not saying anything negative against the others. This was just what fitted to the competences of my little company. And when you look at electrolyzers, that goes for all of them. The most important factor you look at in many ways is the cell voltage. So what happens is that as you apply a cell voltage, current starts flowing. And normally you would say the current is a function of the voltage you apply, and therefore the voltage should be on the horizontal axis, and the current, which is the function, should be on the vertical axis. For historical reasons, hydrogen people show this curve, where you have kind of like the consequence on the horizontal axis and the influence factor on the vertical axis. And what we can see here is that if we apply a voltage of less than 1.48 volts across the membrane, nothing happens. Nothing happens because you are not at the activation potential of the electrolysis reaction. And the effect of that is that you can apply a voltage up to that, and there's no current, and therefore no water is split into hydrogen and oxygen. As you then increase the cell voltage, you get a higher and higher current density measured in a slightly archaic unit, milliamps per square centimeter. Normally, we always stick to our metric system, but in electrolyzers, you tend to use square centimeters for whatever reason. This is full of historical legacy. Different catalysts on the electrodes give different polarization curves, as we call it. Near 3 different materials on the electrodes, 3 different catalyst configurations. And if we look at the efficiency of an electrolyzer, it can be calculated as the activation voltage divided with the actual voltage. So if we want to have 76% system efficiency, we need about 80% cell efficiency. The difference is that the system has a power supply, it has some stray currents, it has some pumping losses and so on. We need to count in 4, maybe 5% losses. If you want to get to 80% efficiency, 1.48 volts, the activation voltage divided with 1.85 volts gives us 80% efficiency. So at this voltage level, we have 80% efficiency. And that means that with the light blue electrode surface, we can push something like 220 milliamps through our surface. If we have 1 square meter electrode, we can apply maybe 2,150 amps. If we have something on the order of 1,350 volts across a number of cells, 700 cells, we get a 3 megawatt electrolyzer. If we could apply the dark blue electrode surface, we could push through 445 milliamps. In that case, the same piece of equipment, the same electrode stacks, same 1 square meter of active surface will yield not 3 megawatts, but 6 megawatts. So there's a big desire to have a smart, efficient electrode surface that has a high statistic efficiency. What we do in my little company is that we work with very competent players at the Danish Technical University, at Siemens, and at a Danish semi-public entity called Force Technologies to develop large surface electrodes. There are basically two ways you can go about it. You can either introduce highly effective catalysts in your surface, but often with a risk of spending a lot of money that would ultimately not work anymore because stray metals plate on top of these surfaces. Or you can go the way where you try to increase the surface area. And as you can see on the roughnesses we are having here, we have a much larger surface area than just the projected area of the electrode. And that's the most common way to go. You just use nickel, very good catalyst, resilient to the corrosive environment, and then you target a large surface area. This is how our company has developed. We did the first all cassette in 21, did the first full stack in 22, first commercial unit in 23. When you develop stuff like this, you do beaker tests, you do small tests with samples that are just in your lab, maybe under pressurized conditions as we have on the right. You can also use a larger cell. In this case, we have one that is 1/10 of a square meter. And you can also do a full-size stack. Here we have a short stack that is a full area, but only a few cells long, so it doesn't consume so much power as we would do in a full system. The stack is behind the corroded plate at the end, and what you see in the front is cooling and gas separation. What we aim for in my little company is to get away from the chemical factory thinking. What you see on the left are two pictures of hydrogen factories. They're made like chemical factories where there's a lot of on-site works. We have tried to make it so that it resembles in the thinking a wind turbine, where the equipment is coming out as factory made and where the site installation work is kept to a minimum and where you don't even need the building. Our reference is wind farms, and here's a picture of a wind farm in the US. It is particularly interesting with the US because in the US, the National Renewable Energy Laboratories makes an annual report on the cost of wind. They also make one for solar, but the one they make for wind is a very good reference. And this is a breakdown of the cost of a land-based wind project. And what you see is that the wind turbine itself accounts for about 70% of the total cost. And other things that you would say are really should be expensive, like the engineering part, acquiring the land, building the roads, putting in foundations, digging cable trenches, putting in cables, building a substation, building fences and control buildings, getting your contingents and so on, is actually not very much. 31 for the balance of plant, 11% for the financing cost. We only add 42% on top of the actual equipment. And that is a very, very efficient way of going about it. And so this is how a hydrogen plant could look if it was built in this way without having to build buildings or making a big chemical factory. What we're doing here is simply using the same modular approach as you will know from wind power, from solar PV. Here's a picture of a hydrogen factory being transported. This is a factory being delivered to a biogas plant that does upgrade of biogas with hydrogen. Such a unit there is mounted in the course of 2 working days. Very often building a hydrogen factory in the field will take 6 months. Here it's done in 2 days because we are cheating applying the technology that we know so well from wind. And then we have the intermittency issue. This is a picture of 2 weeks in Denmark And I took 2 weeks where the share of wind electricity is the same as it was in that year, 45%. The dark blue is wind, the yellow part is solar PV, and then we have decentral heat power and central heating power. And finally, the red curve is the load over 2 weeks. You can see the nightly dip in the load. You can see what we call the cooking peak, where we all cook at the same time in the afternoon. And after that, the load goes down and gets to be low because a lot of industry is not working at night. We don't have the lights on and so on. And as we can see here, it's not enough. It's not at the right time. Solar PV doesn't matter in November. If we were to have 100% wind power, this is how it would look. And since it's reaching out of the axis, I'm reducing it here. Now we have 100% wind power, but it doesn't really help. We still have the 3 days in the beginning where we are way below our load. And we have other periods where we are way above our load. So now it's enough on energy, but it's not at the right time. Backup from solar PV still doesn't work. You can then ask, how much storage do we actually need? This is how much of our load we can get covered by wind power as a function of how much wind power do we have when it comes to energy. So up to about 40%, we can use all the wind power. When we get above 40%, the curve traces off. So if we had 100% wind power relative to our load, we only get coverage of 60% of our actual load, because at other hours, the timing doesn't fit. And it doesn't help much to add a lot more wind power. With 200%, we get to 70%. 1 day of storage, 10 days of storage, 100 days of storage. With 100 days of storage, we could get to about full coverage at about 150% wind power. The reason for it not being just 100% is, of course, that we have losses in storage. So if we look at our options here and look at the storage capacity growing towards the right, and look at the duration going towards the top, we can see that our 1 day minimum means that batteries don't deliver the answer. Batteries work at 4 hours or 6 hours, but don't work at 24 hours. Not that they don't work technically, they work eminently technically. Not just for days, but for weeks and even for months. They're just way too expensive. The only thing that really can be done above 1 day is pumped hydro, good luck in a flat country like Denmark, or hydrogen. We might choose to do our hydrogen as ammonia, but hydrogen is our storage medium. Turning then to another thing which affects us is our pyrolysis project. And this is not about my company or the company I work for, but it's about another way to think about how could we build resilience into our system. The motivation for doing SkyClean, as we call it, or pyrolysis of agricultural waste, is that if we want to stay below the 2% curve, it is not enough just to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We also need to get into the game of having negative emissions. This is from IPCC. They believe we need to have upwards of 20 billion tons of negative CO2 emissions by the end of the century. And you can do that in various ways. You can have machinery like on the left called direct air capture, or you can let nature do the work. Direct air capture is in many ways attractive for people like me, and I think many of you. It's a technical way of absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. It can be done. It's fairly expensive. Today's prices are in the range of $500 per ton of CO2, where we can do plant-based carbon capture on the order of $100 per ton of CO2. But the most important argument against direct air capture is that any machinery that looks like what we see on the left is going to be, fantastic in size, aggregated over the world in order to really make a difference. In the atmosphere, we have 5 million billion tons of air. 5 million billion tons. Assuming that you take that through an array of fans is a very, very long shot. What we see on the middle and on the right is that plants absorb CO2, and they are not as efficient as direct air capture can be made to be. But we have huge area of plants in the world. The way the carbon cycle works in a normal world is that plants take up all their carbon as CO2 from the atmosphere. And plants are a lot of carbon. In the plants we normally know that give us wood for our furniture or floors or house building. Or if we look at straw from crops, they're about 50% carbon by weight. And then there's some oxygen, some hydrogen, some nitrogen, some trace minerals, but 50% is carbon. Each and every carbon atom in the furniture, in the floor, in the room where I'm sitting now, which has a lot of wood in it, each and every carbon atom came from the atmosphere. Nothing came from water, so no irrigation delivers it. Nothing came from fertilizers. It all came from the atmosphere. And that means that all plant waste also has 100% of its carbon from the atmosphere. When that waste is then burned or allowed to rot, all the carbon goes off again as CO2. That is a natural cycle that works all the time around us. We disrupt that cycle. We cannot do anything about the initial part. The plants still get all their carbon from the atmosphere. But we don't allow the material to rot or burn. We expose it to pyrolysis. And that's just a fancy word for heating it to a high temperature, 500, 600 degrees centigrade, with no oxygen present. If there was oxygen, dry plant matter would self-ignite at a temperature of 500 or 600 degrees centigrade. But there is no oxygen present. So what happens is that about 50% of the carbon goes off as a gas with a very mundane name, pyrolysis gas, that can then be turned into fuel. But the other 50% doesn't want to become a gas. It just gets carbonized. And the end result is similar to the coke that was produced in gas plants 100 years ago, when we had a lot of gas in our domestic arrangements and in the street lighting and so on in all big cities in Europe. They used coal as their feedstock. We use plant waste as our feedstock, but it's essentially the same thing. And what comes out of it, we call biochar. And biochar has this one fundamental, super attractive characteristics that no microorganisms can eat it. Microorganisms, they love eating complex carbon molecules. They love eating starch or sugars or cellulose or lignin or whatever, but they cannot eat the pure stuff. So when we have carbon in the shape of coke, which is technically called amorphous carbon, then nothing eats it, and that means you can sequester it for centuries or millennia, or actually for millions of years. When we burn the fuel, we of course release the carbon again as CO2. But since we took away some carbon as biochar, we need some more to run the cycle again. And that way we make carbon negative fuel. The more fuel we make, the less CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is the trick with pyrolysis associated with biochar. And here's a small picture of how that looks in reality. This is a 20 megawatt plant. That is the heat of combustion from the feedstock. What we look at here is the dry, and I have to say that this is a pyrolysis furnace. 20 megawatts is a good place to be because it is big enough to matter, but not so big that the area you need to have feedstock from gets to be too big. So this here has a radius of maybe 20 kilometers of feedstock acquisition. In this case here, it's next to a biogas plant. That's what we see on the right. So it eats or it consumes the waste of waste. Biogas is gasifying waste from agriculture. The SkyClean plant then gets the waste from the biogas plant, the digestate, makes that into fuel and into sequestered carbon. With the gas, we have various options. We can feed it to combustion, as we see on the top, or we could feed it to a refinery, condense oil out of the gas, and then feed the oil to a refinery, make it into fuel. About 50% of the energy content goes off as oil, and 50% doesn't want to condense and can then be used for power and heat. We have a big issue here, a big challenge, in that the refineries, they don't want to take our oil. They would love it, but the precondition is that we'll bring in 100,000 tons. And when you start up a new industry, you don't have 100,000 tons the first year. And we have argued with big refineries here in Denmark and Europe, and they all are, you know, our oil is fantastic quality. It's called slow pyrolysis oil, low acid content, very, very attractive, but bring us 100,000 tons. And we don't have that today. And come back when you get it. So what do you do in the meantime? It turns out, fortunately, that it can be used directly in ship transport. And that's then what we are targeting. It could, in principle, also be used in the truck engines or lorry engines, but it is much more viscous than diesel. And there, for ships that are powered by fuel oil, they already have the heating systems that can lower the viscosity simply by heating the oil. And here's a picture of our first oil condensation that we took place last year. We had actually a slightly comical thing, because the people running the plant, and they did that at night to not disturb daytime experience. This is a 200 kilowatt pyrolysis plant. They called in the late afternoon and said, "Well, we wonder if we will make anything. How will it work out? We don't know. Blah blah blah." And then it started blowing. And then they called in the morning and said, "Oh, for Christ's sake, we now have several barrels, but we have no certificate on the oil. We don't have any safety leaf. We cannot have it here because we need that. We cannot transport it without such a thing. What do we do?" And then, of course, in the end, we sorted it out. So now Denmark has become an oil-producing country, which it has not been for years. So we are very happy about that. And here we get to the other solution of storage. Storage does not need to be batteries. Storage could be done with hydrogen or ammonia, but it could also be done with oil from agricultural waste. Because in reality, we have a lot of wind power and we have a lot of solar power. Our storage need is to be very small. And then you could actually simply just store your oil from pyrolysis and combust it in existing semi-dormant power plant. Then we could solve our intermittency issue. And our third option in this picture here is to add some green hydrogen and make methanol. So that's our third way we can go about our pyrolysis gas. And then a few words at the end of the talk about offshore. The title that was asked to speak on didn't include offshore, but we do need to have a lot of green electrons to work with our hydrogen, with our storage. And part of that will come from floating offshore wind. The resource of offshore wind is unfortunately somewhat limited across the world. The resource locally is abundant. By 2050, Europe will have 50% of its electricity from offshore wind. But those conditions that are favorable for offshore wind don't exist everywhere in the world. We are very lucky in northwestern Europe in that we have a lot of shallow water close to big population centers. The same is the case on the east coast of the US and in China. But in most other countries, it simply gets to be too deep, too fast. If we go to floating, we can expand our resource by a factor of 10. Without floating, we can produce economically about the same electricity as is used in the world. But that basically means overproducing tremendously in northwestern Europe, on the east coast of the US, China, and then still missing electricity in a lot of other countries. The floating wind, we can, so to speak, democratize offshore wind. One of the problems with offshore wind is that offshore foundations tend to be built in shipyards, as you see on the left. And there we have a big discrepancy between the level of industrialization of the turbine equipment and of the floater. What you see on the left is a smaller floater, but if it was a 15 megawatt turbine, as they are going to be within a few years, we have about 1,000 tons of steel in the tower and 4,000 tons of steel in the floater. The tower takes about 4,000 working hours. So logically, the floater should take 20,000 working hours because it's 4 times as heavy. It does not. It takes not 4 times more, but 40 times more because the floater is made by hand, whereas the tower is made in a factory. And cheap things are made in factory. That's just a fact of life. And that is what we set out to replicate in our concept, where we simply assembled it from factory-made modules so that there would be no fabrication in a dry dock or in a shipyard. Here's a series of pictures where you see on the top left the floater being made in a tower factory, the towers in the background, then driven on the road, as you do with towers, assembled in the port, driven out to a semi-submersible barge, having the barge submerging so that the floater could float off, and then installing the turbine in the port. This is our first demo that's been operating for somewhat over 2.5 years by now. Has 53% capacity factor. So a very, very high performance at 200 meters water depth. So it is eminently doable. And here's a little video of the floater in a nice day, which we have a lot of, but then also in a windy day. This is during a storm that had in Scandinavia the name of Pia, 14-meter waves, and operating really smoothly. So very, very nice and fun to be a part of. Here we have it next to a 20 megawatt turbine and with its floater next to the Eiffel Tower. As you can see, for some random reason, the same total weight, but doable in a week rather than in 2 years. 2 years was actually a magnificent performance for such a new structure, but we are in a different place nowadays. So now we are almost at the end. What to kind of say when it comes to all of this? This is really what I think is important. That is that it is doable in all parts of the world, not just in Northwestern Europe, in all parts of the world, to deliver everything that a modern society needs: electricity, ammonia for fertilizers and fuel, hydrogen for chemicals and green steel, and so on, methanol as a precursor of plastics and also as a fuel, gas as we know it, oil, we are getting to know it. We get all of that just out of natural resources. We can, we must decarbonize our energy system completely. And this is actually not difficult. That is the main thing that is sort of the theme, the underlying tone in all of this. Do we have wind power? Yes. Solar PV? Yes. Biogas? Yes. Pyrolysis? Yes. Hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, storage. All of these are known technologies. Sometimes you'll see people or hear people saying, "Oh, we need a lot of new technology. We don't even know now what we don't know. We need fusion energy. We need this. We need that." No, we don't need it. If it turns out to be faster or cheaper or smarter, we should of course use it, but we don't need it. The key message I'm bringing in here is that decarbonizing our energy system, our complete society, including all these other things we don't directly connect with energy, such as chemicals or plastics or whatever, lubricants, you name it. We can do all of that based on existing well-known technologies. It doesn't mean that they are all equally industrialized now. Green hydrogen with electrolyzers is still in its, shall we say, development phase. Ammonia and methanol are known technologies, but they can be made much smarter and much easier to deploy through the same sort of modular thinking as we do in wind power and solar PV. But we can do all of this based on things we know now and do now. We don't need new technologies. So our challenge is not a technological challenge. Our challenge is one of will and effort, but not of technology. Yes, that was what I had on the table. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Heinrich. We'll now move to questions. I don't think the roving microphones are working, so you'll have to use your lungs and speak up, please. So, do we have a question? Gordon, you have a question?
Yes. Well, I heard of an announcement between Stiesdal and Danfoss, which is a huge Danish-based company now, I think in 100 countries around the world. Could we learn something from Henrik about the significance of that?
Yes, we can. And let me see, maybe I should just share again. Let me just get to the relevant page of the presentation. Just a second. So, I just share my screen here. Just a second. What we would like to do is to do chemical factories, in this case hydrogen factories, in the same way as we do wind turbines. And to some extent, this is how should I put it? This is a consequence of the fact that I and my key colleagues all come out of the wind industry. So we are in this way somewhat like a man with a hammer, to whom everything looks like a nail. So when considering doing an electrolyzer, we were not ingenious enough to find any other solution than doing like we do in wind. And what you do in wind is that you look for suppliers who are capable of supplying big volumes of relevant equipment without you having to do it yourself. There have been wind companies that tried to have a deep vertical integration, but they have all basically gone there and come back again. So what a wind company does is that it leaves to people who are competent to do what they are good at, and then the wind company basically does assembly and projects. And before that, they did the original design. They did not design the gearbox or the generator or the bearing, but they did the original design of how to use it and made specifications out of which the gearbox company or the generator company or the bearing company made, to the largest extent possible, a standardized product. That has turned out to be super efficient when it comes to bringing down the cost. And that's what we do here. So on this picture here, you see a green cylinder in the inside of which is something pinkish. And on the outside, you see a blue short container and a yellow piece of equipment, and then a transparent box. What this shows is the electrolyzer stack, as we call it, a series of 700 electrodes that are inside a pressure vessel. And those electrodes, we were looking around to find who could build our electrodes. We could not go out and buy electrodes from a competitor. And any hydrogen company that's worth its salt has its own electrode factory. That's what hydrogen companies do. We decided we didn't want to do that. We wanted to find somebody who was better at it than us, who already did something similar in big volumes. And here our choice went to people who do plate heat exchangers, because plate heat exchangers are using big stainless plates that are pressed on big presses and are used for heat transfer purposes. They're not used for electrolyzers, but basically the processes are the same as for electrolyzers. And there we have two big companies in Scandinavia, and we work with both of them, Danfoss in Denmark and Alfa Laval in Sweden. Between them, they make 200,000 tons of stainless steel coils into plates for heat exchangers every year, 200,000 tons. If we are to build 1 gigawatt of electrolyzers, we need 2,000 tons per year, 1% of what they do now. In other words, supplying us with a huge volume, 1 gigawatt is approximately what is installed in Europe now of electrolyzers. In the US, as we sit here and talk, there are 350 megawatts of electrolyzers. Making 3 times the volume that exists in the US would absorb 1% of the capacity of Alfa Laval and Danfoss. So that's the whole logic. Find somebody who can do it. And in this case, it is the two big heat exchanger companies. We worked first with Danfoss, and the agreement that you read about was our supply agreement with Danfoss to do electrolyzer plates, or rather full electrolyzer cassettes, bipolar plates for our electrolyzers.
Thank you.
Do we have another question? Yes, Mark.
Thank you, Alec, for a very interesting talk. You spoke about agricultural waste and using pyrolysis to make oil. How do you define agricultural waste? Because what some people call waste, others might call fertilizer, compost, nutrients. If we take too many nutrients from the soil without putting waste back into it, don't we risk making land infertile?
Yeah, that's a super good point, and I should say that my use of the term waste is, of course, something that should be taken with some reservation. In Denmark, we use a certain amount of what you could call residual carbon content of agricultural products, what does not go into the grain. but does not become a feed for cattle or for pigs or whatever, for various purposes. Some of it is actually just burned for heat. Some of it is mulched into the soil. Some of it is gasified in biogas and so on. But some of it is just plowed into the ground where it will rot very quickly. And what we try to do is to take those fractions of the residues that are not used for other purposes and turn them into sequestered carbon that has a fertilizing effect. The trick here is that the feedstock that we use, which is typically either straw or biogas digestate, has certain nutrients, and those nutrients get out not with the gas but with the biochar. They are not chemically bound to the carbon, so they are absorbed on the surfaces of this very porous mass we call biochar. And from that surface, they gradually leach out. If you spread the biochar on agricultural soil, to basically return all the nutrients to the soil. And in addition to that, the biochar has certain soil improving characteristics. It has a good water retention when you are in dry areas, and it actually serves also, even though it sounds strange, having these granules in clay soil, it tends to improve transportation of water during wet seasons. So growth experiments show that you get clear fertilizing effects and soil improvement by returning your biochar to the soil. And that means that the soil is not depleted. It's actually the other way around. Soil gets the same nutrients as if we had mulched the straw or the biogas digestate, but it gets an additional soil improving effect out of the biochar. And a big part of the world market for biochar is actually for soil improvement purposes and not for carbon sequestration.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have another question? Yes, Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the informative presentation. Going on with the same point, I was thinking on the same lines when you mentioned essentially using biomass as a feedstock to produce oil for intermittency purposes. You have the intermittency when there's solar. And you mentioned obviously the energy streams and enormous capacity that would be needed. I recall 100-day storage and 150% wind capacity for 100% coverage. So if you have to do 100-day storage for oil, how much biogas feedstock would you need? Or would you go to different?
Yeah, it's clear that in our small country, there's a limit to how much we can do. We think we can acquire about something on the order of 2 million tons of agricultural waste per year in Denmark. And that yields a total carbon sequestration that's roughly 1-to-1. So it reduces our national accounting of emissions by about 2 million tons. The bigger part of that is through the biochar, a smaller part is through substitution of fossil fuels. That would involve here something on the order of 500,000 tons of oil per year out of Danish agricultural waste. So in Denmark, we are not in the millions of tons, but it would be more than adequate to cover the risk of darkness periods that come out of our renewable electricity supply. So for a country like Denmark, we could get our resilience against the shall we say, the dark periods of no wind and no solar power, of oil from pyrolysis. If you look at Europe, you don't have as ready knowledge the figure for Great. Look at Europe, we have somewhat over 50 times more agricultural residues that's not used for other purposes and could be, and that would then yield something on the order of, if we have 100 million tons, we 20 million tons of oil, something on that magnitude.
Do we have any more? Yes. Okay.
Thank you for most interesting information. Mind-boggling. I came across when I was going, ammonia can be used as a fuel for shipping. I'm just puzzled why or how that could be. Have you got anything to say about that?
Yeah, the fuel for shipping, of course, you need to look at from an energy point of view. The fuel we make has about 2/3 of the energy content per ton compared with fossil. The reference nowadays is, here in Denmark at least, is called very low sulfur fuel oil, VLS FO. And we have about 2/3 of the energy content, but we have a somewhat higher density. So when it comes to the vessel as such, you get more or less the same range if you were to fuel by bio-oil. In the long run, I think that the two alternative fuels are more, yeah, that's maybe even taking it a bit too far. The way it works now is that we have a shipping industry that has been relying on diesel and on fuel oil. As it is now, there's a significant move towards using LNG as a fuel for the engines. For that, you need a so-called dual fuel engine that has different feed systems for fuel oil and for the gas. You need to do the same if you want to fire your engine with methanol or with ammonia. Methanol is what the Danish big shipping company Maersk has decided to put its money on, at least in the first phase. And they've ordered a total of 25 relatively large container vessels powered by methanol. But methanol has the disadvantage that it uses quite a lot of green carbon. And green carbon will be a scarce resource in the future because we do need carbon for many, many things. And if it is fossil carbon, ultimately it gets emitted as fossil CO2. If it is green, we know that it has absorbed CO2 during the production of it. And then, of course, it re-emits, but the balance gets to a zero. In the fossils, yes, it did absorb from the atmosphere, but that was 200 million years ago. And that's why we have the problem that we are missing it now without having absorbed it in the spring. So ammonia is actually both cheaper and from a climate and resource perspective, better fuel. Because it can be made just out of green electricity to produce hydrogen and air to produce nitrogen. You do that with an air separation unit or with a so-called nitrogen generator. So ammonia has no carbon content, and it is on a heat of combustion about equivalent to methanol. Both of them need an ignition fuel. So when you have a shipping company that says, oh yes, we go the methanol way, that's good, but they still have 5 or 10% of the energy coming from a co-injection of a fossil fuel to ignite the combustion at each stroke. So a very first use of bio-oil would be to go to methanol ships or ammonia ships and say, we deliver a green alternative to your black firing fuel that can keep your combustion going. Another way to go about it would be to look at the big shipping companies and say, well, we know that you are buying 25 methanol ships. Good for you. You still have 700 oil fuel solution with them. And in that respect, oil made with pyrolysis has a one interesting feature, and that is that the sequestration of carbon. We'll decide to say, yes, we sequester carbon, and that's good. We need to take it away from the atmosphere. That's where I come from. I developed the technology with my team, or our motivation in that development. But you could also argue, well, it's very important to get shipping decarbonized. So what one could do in effect would be to fire with 1/3 bio-oil, 2/3 fuel oil, because the carbon sequestration associated with the bio-oil would mean that with 1/3 bio-oil, you compensate for the 2/3 of fuel oil with the sequestration of your biochar. And that could be a way whereby you could have a lifeline to shipping during the years where it's in the transition phase until it gets to be totally converted to ammonia or methanol. It has to be said that we are looking into a conservative sector of industry. Shipping is not used to changing their course from one day to the next. But rules are coming into play where, for instance, in European waters, we now have regulations that from, I forget when, 29 or whatever, you need to have such and such a big part of carbon neutral fuel or pay penalties for that. It is not yet global, but IMO is working on, International Maritime Organization is working on, I don't know if they are similar, but rules that would mean that this gets to have a higher and higher priority. In the long run, as I see it, the technically most attractive solution would be to switch to ammonia for your fuel. There's one big disadvantage, and that is that it is toxic. So you need to think that through. It's not a problem on the vessels. That's easily solved on the vessels. But with your bunkering stations, you would have big volumes of stored ammonia. And there you need to be sure you have a way to handle that in a safe manner if you ever get a leakage problem.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Henrik, thank you very much for the presentation. You talked quite well about the intermittency problem and the possible mitigations against that. And I know one area that you've looked at in the past is mechanical or thermal energy storage. But if I understand correctly, you've turned away from that a little bit now as a company. Could you perhaps just put some words to that decision?
Yes.
And how you see the storage area?
Yeah, I would be happy to do that. Yeah, I if we take a step back, around 2010, I sort of reached a point in my time as the technical lead on wind power where I felt pretty good about the trajectories. And I kind of made 5 questions you could ask of an energy source for it to be a preferred source. You needed to be able to get enough. Well, by then we already could see that we would be able in Denmark. Okay, check. Need to be something that did not destroy the climate. Offshore wind and onshore wind are the lowest CO2 emission per energy unit of all known technologies. Nuclear power is close. So we speak something like 10 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour as a life cycle emission from on and offshore wind, 12 nuclear, 40 from solar PV, from gas, 750 from coal. Gas, assuming that you do not do fracking. If you do fracking, gas is as bad as coal, because you have unavoidable methane leakages, and methane, as we all know, is a very strong greenhouse gas. So enough, yes, check. Without spoiling the climate, check. Being publicly acceptable. But that's the offshore track came in. That of course there are problems with placing big industrial equipment in the landscape when it comes to onshore application of wind. But when you go beyond 40 kilometers out to sea, you simply cannot see the turbines. And then there will always be objectors with whatever reasons, but it is as close to something that's publicly acceptable as we'll ever get. Number 4, affordable. In 2010, when I went through this mental exercise for the first time, not yet for offshore, and there was in 2012 actually a big discussion in the wind community. What dared we promise the politicians? And at that time it was about 150 euros per megawatt hour, and the question was, would we get below 100 by 2020? And we actually had two relatively sharply divided fractions. One saying this is too dangerous. That was about 2/3 of the players, including wind companies and developers and so on. 1/3 saying no, we need to get below 100 because that's a magic number. 99.9 is a lot better. A 2-digit number, a lot better than 100.01. And I was in the second group, and we actually won the argument, but it was done in the way that we said for projects that had final investment decision in 20, we would be below 100. As it went by 16, 17, we were down below 70, and now we are in the range of 50. So it became affordable. We did not have the full trajectory in 10, but it looked good. And then the final 5th one was for something to be a preferred energy source. Enough, check. Not spoiling the climate, check. And not having public, too much public opposition, check. Affordable, would come when we need it. Oh, the missing link. And from then on, I got more involved in developing storage solutions and quickly landed on thermal as a smart way of doing it. So when I retired from Siemens at the end of 2014, I continued with that and developed further the technology, which is a heat pump based system to do energy storage in crushed rock, where you heat the rock to 600 degrees centigrade. It's stored in insulated tanks, and when you need the power back, you will use the stored heat in the rocks to heat air and drive an air turbine. Because it's a heat pump charging system, you get a COP of 350%. When you discharge, you get an efficiency of 20%. Total gross efficiency 70%, power to power. Actual real life efficiency on the order of 60%. Much better than hydrogen at 35. Much cheaper than batteries. So we have developed that system with turbo machinery and everything, and it's eminently doable. There just is no market pull. So if you look at the system operators in the world, so National Grid in the UK, or something called Energinet in Denmark, or whoever in Europe, yeah, they would like to have some storage, but they don't want to have any regulatory system that ensures that you get a business case out of it. We're just socializing the cost of intermittency as it is at the moment. And so having looked at that and saying, we have this bright idea, we have our prototype, we have everything, but is it going to happen? unfortunately, by the end of 22, we had to realize that no, it's not going to happen. And one of the things that is a disadvantage is that a dedicated energy storage system is a one-trick pony. It stores electricity. But something based on hydrogen or bio-oil has many applications. Hydrogen, as we saw in the diagrams, many applications directly as something for green steel, or as a feedstock for ammonia, or as an input for the chemical industry, or put together with green carbon to make methanol, or what have you. It's a multi-trick pony. But the storage system we had developed was a single trick pony. And that makes a big difference in the viability of it. And the way it looks now, it is more expensive, quite a lot actually, than our thermal system. Our thermal system was the cheapest system you could get for long duration. Batteries is by far the cheapest. But when you get to long, it gets to be too high, and then it makes much more sense to do thermal or something similar. But it doesn't matter, it doesn't drive a business case. What drives the volume is actually that multi-faceted applications. And when it comes to as we grow our renewable fleet, we are going to need storage. I showed you the diagrams that I have been working on in various forms over many years. Where how does it look now? How would it look if we had 100% wind energy? But that's not where we are going. In Denmark, we are launching now an application process. It was announced last week that would ultimately take us to 10 gigawatts more of offshore wind. We have a total on the order of 5 gigawatts of wind power now. We are looking at 20 gigawatts of solar. Okay, so we are seeing something like 15, maybe 20 gigawatts of offshore wind and onshore wind, 20 gigawatts of solar. Our average consumption in Denmark is 4.5 gigawatts. What in the world do we want with 20 plus 20 gigawatts? Of course, they have their capacity factors, so the energy is not the same. On offshore wind, it's 50%. On onshore wind, it's nowadays 33%. On solar in Denmark, it's maybe 18%. But what are we going to do with all that power? It's going to be used for hydrogen. That's the whole trick. Some of it is going to be used, but it's a moderate amount for higher electricity consumption. A lot of it is going to be used for hydrogen. Okay, so Denmark will become a net exporting country of renewables, and a lot of other countries could go the same way. The UK has fantastic offshore resources. When it comes to storage, it has the effect that during almost all hours we have an overcapacity. And what is then arranged is that the system operator is able to turn down the supply of electricity to hydrogen, so that it takes really windless days, really dark days, for us not to have enough wind power and solar put together to cover our direct needs. So a calculation has been made last year of how it looks in Denmark, and the storage requirement in Denmark in a normal climate year is 0 hours. So the motivation for doing storage here in this country, with its very significant benefits of being connected to some strong grids in Sweden, Norway, and Germany, our storage requirement nationally is a big round 0 in a normal climate year. Then they looked at extreme climate years. How much do we need there? And in the most extreme, a 40-year extreme, we need about 200 hours of storage. There's no way in the world we can get a business case out of thermal storage if there's actually no need for storage in Denmark. There's no way in the world we can get that if every now and then in a certain year we might need up to 200 hours. It just doesn't fly. What does fly is to have a cavern or a series of caverns storing hydrogen that's intended for export, but if we had bad climate here, we use some of that for combustion in thermal power plants. What does make sense is to store a reserve of bio-oil and then keep on feeding shipping companies. And if in a bad climate here we use some of our stock, we refill that before we start supplying to shipping. And that is the root cause why we said, let's put it on the back burner. It still is, in our opinion, the most economic way of storing electricity. But we can, it doesn't cut any ice that we please ourselves with strong statements about that if there's not a market. So that's the story.